Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring a question that has haunted law enforcement, consumer safety experts, and ordinary Americans for more than 4 decades. Someone walked into a store, or a series of stores, somewhere in the Chicago area in the autumn of 1982, opened bottles of one of the most trusted medicines in America, laced the contents with a deadly poison, resealed those bottles, and placed them back on the shelves. 7 people died, and to this day, no one has ever been charged with those killings. Here's what happened. In the autumn of 1982, 7 people in the Chicago metropolitan area died after taking what they believed was a safe and ordinary household pain reliever. They were not soldiers or politicians or figures of any particular public prominence. They were ordinary people, parents, siblings, neighbors. They reached for extra-strength Tylenol capsules the same way millions of Americans did every single day, expecting relief from a headache or a cold. What they got instead was potassium cyanide. And someone, somewhere, put it there. The unsolved case that followed would permanently change the way every bottle of medicine in America is sealed, shipped, and sold. It would force Congress to act. It would force an entire industry to rethink its relationship with the public. And it would leave investigators, journalists, and the families of the victims with a question they are still asking today. Who did this? And why? Let's go back to the beginning. Context: Chicago, 1982. To understand why the Chicago Tylenol murders hit so hard, you have to understand the world they happened in. The year was 1982. The United States was in the middle of a significant economic recession. Ronald Reagan was in the White House. And in homes across the country, a bottle of Tylenol in the medicine cabinet was about as unremarkable a sight as a carton of milk in the refrigerator. Tylenol was, at that point, the best-selling over-the-counter pain reliever in the United States. It was trusted, it was familiar, it was the thing parents reached for when their children had a fever at 2 in the morning. Johnson & Johnson, the company that manufactured Tylenol under its McNeil Consumer Products subsidiary, had built that trust over decades. The brand was synonymous with reliability. And that trust, as it turned out, made it the perfect weapon for whoever chose to use it as one. The Chicago metropolitan area in 1982 was a sprawling collection of neighborhoods, suburbs, and small towns spread across Cook County and the surrounding region. Elk Grove Village, Arlington Heights, Winfield, Lombard, these were the kinds of communities where people shopped at the same grocery stores, knew their neighbors, and sent their kids to the local schools. They were not places where people expected to encounter mass murder. No one did, and the timing of what unfolded, over a matter of days in late September and early October of 1982, made the tragedy even more disorienting. These deaths did not all happen at once. They accumulated, one by one, while investigators struggled to understand what they were looking at. The connection between the victims was not obvious. They did not know each other. They lived in different communities. They had different doctors, different routines, different lives. What they shared was a bottle. Why does this case still matter, more than 40 years later? Because its consequences reach into your home right now. The foil seal you peel off a bottle of ibuprofen before you take it. The plastic wrap around the cap of your cough syrup. The shrink band around the lid of your vitamins. All of it, every bit of tamper-evident packaging on every over-the-counter product you have ever purchased, exists in direct response to what happened in Chicago in the fall of 1982. This is one of those cases where the story does not end when the investigation stalls. The story just keeps going, in a different form, every single day. Beat 1. A painkiller turns deadly. It began, as so many tragedies do, with something that looked like nothing at all. A person feeling unwell. A bottle of medicine taken from a shelf. A capsule swallowed. And then, very quickly, death. The first deaths emerged in the Chicago area in late September 1982. Emergency responders were called. Medical professionals worked to determine what had gone wrong. In those early hours, there was no reason to suspect anything other than a tragic but isolated medical event. People die unexpectedly. It happens. And at first, the deaths appeared unconnected. But then there were more. And investigators began to notice something deeply troubling. These were not elderly patients with long medical histories. These were not people whose deaths had an obvious explanation. They were people who had, by all available accounts, been in relatively ordinary health, and who had died suddenly and inexplicably. And in at least some of the cases, family members or first responders mentioned something in common. Tylenol, According to public records and news accounts from the period, it was a combination of medical examiners, emergency room physicians, and local health officials working in the Chicago area who began to piece together the possibility that a single product might be the connecting thread. That moment of recognition, when the dots began to connect across what had appeared to be entirely separate tragedies, marked one of the most significant public health breakthroughs in the investigation. It also triggered an immediate and urgent question. If one bottle was poisoned, how many more were out there? Laboratory analysis of the capsules recovered from victims and their homes confirmed what investigators had begun to fear. Extra-strength Tylenol capsules had been adulterated with potassium cyanide. Potassium cyanide, a substance with no legitimate use in consumer medication. A substance so lethal that a small quantity is sufficient to kill a human being within minutes. It had been placed inside capsules that were then resealed and, investigators concluded based on the geographic spread of the contaminated bottles, returned to store shelves at various retail locations across the Chicago area. The fact that contaminated bottles were found at multiple retail locations was critically important. It told investigators something about where the tampering had most likely occurred. If the poison had been introduced during the manufacturing process at a Johnson & Johnson facility, investigators would have expected to see contamination traceable to a single production run, a single batch, a single point of origin in the supply chain. Instead, what they found was contamination scattered across bottles purchased from different stores in different parts of the Chicago metropolitan area. This pattern strongly suggested that someone had physically gone into retail locations, taken bottles from the shelves, tampered with them, and put them back. The manufacturer, based on the available evidence, had not been the point of contamination. At least 7 people died in what are classified as the original 1982 poisonings. They came from different communities, different family situations, different walks of life. And the thread connecting them was a product they had every reason in the world to trust. Some of them may have been experiencing nothing more serious than a headache or a common cold when they reached for a capsule that someone had deliberately made into a killing instrument. We pause here to remember them not as data points in a criminal investigation, but as people. Their deaths were not abstractions. They were the loss of real human lives from real communities, and they are the reason this case matters. The public response was swift and, in some ways, unprecedented. Once investigators and public health officials understood what they were dealing with, warnings went out through every available channel. Television broadcasts, radio alerts, and in a detail that speaks to the urgency of those early days, police vehicles drove through Chicago neighborhoods using loudspeakers to warn residents not to take Tylenol. Think about that for a moment. Police cars in the streets of American cities, broadcasting warnings about a bottle of pain reliever. That is how serious this had become, and how fast. Johnson & Johnson's response to the crisis has been studied for decades in business schools and crisis management programs. The company made the decision to issue a nationwide recall of approximately 31 million bottles of Tylenol products. 31 million bottles. The financial cost was enormous. The short-term damage to the brand was severe. And the decision to act so broadly, when the known contamination was confined to the Chicago area, was not the obvious choice from a purely business standpoint. But Johnson & Johnson made it anyway. The company cooperated with investigators, pulled its product from shelves, and prioritized public safety over quarterly earnings. It is widely credited as one of the defining examples of ethical corporate crisis management in modern American business history. The company also worked with law enforcement to assist in any way possible with the investigation. It offered a significant reward for information leading to the identification and conviction of whoever was responsible for the tampering. Johnson & Johnson did not attempt to minimize what had happened or deflect attention from the product. It faced the crisis directly. But even as the corporate response drew widespread praise, the criminal investigation was just beginning. And it would prove to be one of the most challenging, and ultimately most frustrating, investigations in American law enforcement history. Here is a question worth sitting with as we move into the investigation itself. If you had been in Chicago in the autumn of 1982, and you had a bottle of Tylenol at home, what would you have done? Would the public warnings have reached you in time? Would you have trusted that the bottle you already had was safe? And does it change your answer to know that even today, the person responsible has never been identified? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know how you would have responded. Beat 2. The investigation and the extortion letter. When a crime of this nature occurs, the investigative response is typically proportional to its severity. And few crimes in modern American history triggered a more rapid and extensive multi-agency response than the Chicago Tylenol murders. Within days of the deaths being linked to the contaminated capsules, a coordinated investigation was underway involving some of the most significant law enforcement and regulatory bodies in the country. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was involved. The Food and Drug Administration, which has regulatory authority over consumer drug products, was involved. The Illinois State Police were involved. And local law enforcement agencies from across the Chicago metropolitan area contributed investigators, resources, and jurisdiction. It was, by any measure, a serious and well-resourced investigation. And yet, the central challenge investigators faced from the very beginning was the nature of the tampering itself. The poisoning had occurred, by all available evidence, at the retail level. Not at the factory, not in the warehouse, in a store, or in several stores, which meant that whoever had done this had walked into ordinary retail establishments, removed bottles from the shelves, taken them somewhere private, or perhaps stood in an aisle and tampered with them directly, replaced the capsule contents with potassium cyanide, and put the bottles back. And then walked away. In 1982, that last detail matters enormously. In 1982, the technological tools that investigators take for granted today simply did not exist in the same form. Retail stores were not blanketed with high-resolution digital surveillance cameras recording continuous footage. There was no network of electronic transaction records that could reliably place a specific individual at a specific location at a specific time. DNA testing, which would later become one of the most transformative tools in forensic investigation, was not yet available to law enforcement as a practical investigative resource. Investigators working the Tylenol case were operating with the tools of their era: witness interviews, physical evidence, tip lines, and deductive reasoning. Those tools were capable of solving a great many crimes. This was not one of them. Investigators canvassed the retail locations where contaminated bottles had been purchased or recovered. They interviewed store employees, customers, and witnesses. They examined the physical bottles themselves for any trace evidence that might point to a specific individual. They followed leads that came in through tip lines. And they pursued every viable avenue they could identify. None of it produced a person they could charge with the poisonings. The investigation did, however, produce one significant arrest. But the details of that arrest are more complicated, and more important to get right, than they are sometimes presented. In the days following the deaths, Johnson & Johnson received a letter. The letter was sent by a man named James W. Lewis, a resident of New York City at the time. In the letter, Lewis made a claim of responsibility for the killings and demanded $1 million from the company to stop them. The letter was, by any measure, a shocking document, and it immediately made Lewis a focus of intense investigative attention. James W. Lewis was located, and he was prosecuted. But the charge he was convicted of was not murder. It was not the poisonings. It was extortion. Specifically, he was convicted of extortion in connection with the letter he had sent to Johnson & Johnson demanding money. He received a prison sentence for that crime. Here's where the distinction matters, and where accuracy demands precision. Lewis himself stated publicly that the claim of responsibility in the letter was false. He maintained that he had sent the letter as an extortion scheme, not as a genuine admission of guilt in the poisonings. And investigators, despite extensive efforts, were unable to establish his involvement in the poisonings themselves. No physical evidence connecting Lewis to the contaminated capsules was ever produced in court. No charge related to the poisonings was ever filed against him. Per the public record, the extortion conviction is what stands. Lewis died in 2023. He was never charged with the murders. The case of the extortion letter illustrates one of the complicating realities of high-profile criminal investigations. A crime of this magnitude, receiving this level of national attention, attracts a variety of individuals with a variety of motivations. Some are legitimate witnesses, some have genuine information, and some are opportunists, individuals who see a high-profile crisis as an opportunity to make demands, claims, or disruptions of their own. The extortion letter, whatever its origin and whatever its intent, consumed investigative resources and complicated the effort to find the actual perpetrator of the killings. Meanwhile, the physical investigation at the store level was presenting its own formidable challenges. The contaminated bottles had passed through many hands before reaching the victims. They had been manufactured, packaged, shipped, received by a distributor, shipped again, received by a retailer, stocked on a shelf, handled by store employees, and potentially touched by multiple customers before being purchased. Each of those steps represented a potential point of contact and a potential loss of trace evidence. The forensic complexity was enormous. Investigators also had to grapple with the question of motive. Why would someone do this? The deaths appeared random. The victims did not appear to be specifically targeted as individuals. The choice of a nationally distributed consumer product suggested either a desire to cause widespread harm, a grievance against the company that manufactured it, a desire for financial gain through extortion or perhaps financial speculation, or some combination of factors that investigators could not definitively pin down without a suspect to interrogate. The absence of an obvious motive, while not uncommon in criminal investigations, made the search for a perpetrator significantly harder. Tip lines generated thousands of calls. Each one had to be evaluated. Each credible lead had to be pursued. Each witness had to be interviewed. This is the part of criminal investigation that rarely makes headlines, the painstaking, resource-intensive work of following every thread to see where it leads. In the Tylenol case, thread after thread led investigators to a dead end. The case did not close. It never officially closed, but as the months passed and the leads dried up, the active intensity of the investigation inevitably began to shift. New crimes demanded attention, resources were reallocated, and the Chicago Tylenol murders settled into that uncomfortable category of cases that investigators had not solved, had not given up on, and did not know how to move forward on. Unsolved. And then, in the months and years following the 1982 murders, something terrible happened that made the already grave situation worse. Copycat crimes began to emerge. Other individuals, inspired or emboldened by what had happened in Chicago, began tampering with consumer products across the country. Additional deaths resulted from these subsequent tampering incidents. The Tylenol case had not just been a tragedy in itself. It had demonstrated to anyone willing to learn the wrong lessons from it that retail consumer products were vulnerable, that their vulnerability could be exploited at scale, and that the consequences could be enormous. This is the moment in the investigation where I want to ask you something directly. Knowing that the tampering almost certainly happened at the retail level, knowing that multiple stores in multiple locations were involved, and knowing that this was 1982 with none of the surveillance infrastructure we have today, does the lack of an arrest surprise you? Or does the evidence, such as it is, point in a direction that you think investigators may have underweighted? Tell me what you think in the comments. This is a case where the analytical work is genuinely still open, and the perspective of people engaging seriously with the facts still matters. Beat 3. A nation reacts: legislation, packaging, and legacy. The Chicago Tylenol murders did not just change an investigation. They changed the country, and the changes they triggered were so comprehensive and so lasting that they have become invisible to most of the people who live inside them every day. Let's make them visible again. Before October 1982, there was no federal law in the United States that specifically criminalized the tampering with consumer products. Think about that. In the most commercially sophisticated consumer market in the world, a person could deliberately contaminate a product on a store shelf without facing a charge specifically tied to that act of tampering. Existing laws covering poisoning, assault, murder, and related offenses certainly applied. But there was no targeted federal statute that said, in explicit terms, tampering with a consumer product is a federal crime. Congress moved to change that. In 1983, following the Tylenol murders and the wave of copycat incidents that followed, the United States Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act. This legislation made it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. It established specific federal jurisdiction over such crimes and created meaningful criminal penalties for anyone found guilty of product tampering. The law was a direct legislative response to what had happened in Chicago, and it represented an acknowledgement that the existing legal framework had not anticipated this specific category of crime with sufficient precision. The FDA moved simultaneously on a regulatory front. New requirements were established mandating tamper-evident packaging for over-the-counter medications. This was not a voluntary industry initiative or a gentle suggestion. It was a regulatory mandate. If you wanted to sell an over-the-counter medication in the United States, your packaging had to include features that would make tampering detectable. A consumer opening a product should be able to tell, from physical evidence, whether the product had been opened before. That principle, which seems obvious and almost self-evident to us today, was a regulatory revolution in 1982 and 1983. The practical implementation of these new requirements transformed the packaging of virtually every over-the-counter consumer healthcare product sold in the United States. Manufacturers developed and deployed a range of tamper-evident technologies. foil seals bonded to the inside of bottle openings, shrink wrap bands applied around caps and lids, cotton or foam fillers inside bottles, heat-sealed outer wrappings, breakaway rings on bottle caps that separate the first time the cap is opened. Many products incorporated multiple layers of these protections simultaneously. The goal was redundancy. Even if one protective feature could theoretically be defeated, others would remain to alert a consumer to potential tampering. The costs involved in this industry-wide transformation were substantial. Manufacturers had to redesign packaging, acquire new equipment, and absorb the ongoing expense of more complex packaging materials. Retailers had to adapt their operations. The entire supply chain had to recalibrate. And consumers had to learn to look for, and respond to, the new safety indicators on the products they purchased. The industry complied, and over time, the expectation of tamper-evident packaging became so deeply embedded in consumer culture that most people today have no idea it was not always there. Johnson & Johnson's response to the crisis extended beyond the recall. The company also made a decision about the product form itself. Tylenol capsules, the powder-filled gelatin shells that had been the tampered product, were ultimately discontinued for over-the-counter sale. In their place, Johnson & Johnson introduced solid caplets, tablets coated to make them easier to swallow, but without the hollow interior that had made capsules so vulnerable to tampering. A capsule, by its nature, could be opened, emptied, refilled, and resealed with relatively little difficulty. A solid caplet could not. The physical design of the product was changed to remove the vulnerability that had made the crime possible. This decision had ripple effects throughout the pharmaceutical industry. Other manufacturers evaluated their own capsule products and made similar decisions. The capsule format for over-the-counter medications effectively disappeared from the American market in the years following the Tylenol murders, replaced by tablets, caplets, and gel-coated alternatives that offered the same ease of swallowing without the same physical vulnerability. The corporate response of Johnson & Johnson to the 1982 crisis is studied to this day as a landmark example of ethical crisis management. Business schools, public relations programs, and corporate governance courses return to it repeatedly because it illustrates a set of choices that were genuinely difficult and genuinely costly, made in favor of public safety over short-term financial interest. The company communicated transparently with the public and with investigators. It acted quickly and broadly rather than defensively and narrowly. And it cooperated fully with regulatory and law enforcement agencies at every stage. The result, counterintuitively, was that Johnson & Johnson ultimately recovered its market position. Tylenol, reintroduced with new tamper-evident packaging, regained consumer trust over the months and years following the crisis. The brand survived, and the crisis response became, in the long history of American corporate behavior, one of the comparatively rare examples of a company doing the right thing under extraordinary pressure and being rewarded, eventually, for having done so. But the copycat crimes that followed the original 1982 murders complicated this legacy considerably. The Tylenol murders had demonstrated, in the most terrible possible way, that over-the-counter consumer products were vulnerable to retail-level tampering. That knowledge did not remain exclusive to law enforcement. In the months and years following the original crimes, other individuals tampered with consumer products in incidents across the country. Some of those incidents resulted in additional deaths. Others were detected before anyone was harmed. But the pattern of copycat activity was real, and it was serious, and it forced law enforcement to develop new protocols for investigating and prosecuting product tampering as a distinct category of crime. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act, passed in 1983, gave prosecutors the tools they needed to charge individuals in these subsequent cases. Several convictions followed in copycat cases over the years, demonstrating that the new legal framework worked as intended. The original case, however, the one that prompted all of this, remained unresolved. Over the decades that followed, the Chicago Tylenol case was periodically revisited. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, conducted renewed reviews of the evidence. Advances in forensic science, including the development and refinement of DNA testing, created at least the theoretical possibility that evidence preserved from 1982 might yield new information when examined with modern techniques. Whether such examinations produced meaningful new leads is not a matter of detailed public record. What is a matter of public record is that no individual has ever been charged with the 1982 Tylenol poisonings. The case remains open. Now here is the question I want to leave with you as we move toward the conclusion of this case. Given everything we know about the physical evidence, the investigative limitations of the era, the nature of the tampering, the extortion letter, and the absence of any charge in more than 4 decades, what do you think happened? Was this a targeted act of grievance against a specific corporation? Was it a random act of destruction carried out by someone whose motive investigators never identified? Was it a calculated extortion scheme that went wrong, carried out by a person whose identity we may actually know from the public record? Or was it something else entirely? I want to know what you think. Leave your theory in the comments, and keep it grounded in the publicly available facts. This community does some of its best work in that thread. The legacy of the Chicago Tylenol murders is not just about the investigation. It is about what those 7 deaths revealed about a gap in the protection of consumer safety, and about how American institutions, both governmental and corporate, responded to that gap. The response was not perfect. It could not bring back the people who died. It could not close the case. But it built a framework of consumer protection that has, in the view of most public health experts, prevented additional deaths from product tampering in the decades since. The next time you peel a foil seal off a bottle of aspirin, or break the shrink band on a bottle of vitamins, or hear that satisfying snap of a safety ring coming off a bottle cap, you are interacting, physically and directly, with the legacy of what happened in Chicago in 1982. That legacy was purchased at a terrible price. 7 people who did nothing wrong paid it. Resolution and current status. More than 4 decades have now passed since the autumn of 1982. The children of the original victims have grown up, had their own families, and in some cases have lived entire adult lives in the shadow of an event that was never, legally, resolved. The investigators who worked the original case have retired or passed away. The retail stores where the contaminated bottles may have been tampered with have long since changed their operations beyond recognition. The world of 1982 is, in many ways, unrecognizable from our current vantage point. And yet the case file for the Chicago Tylenol murders remains open. No individual has ever been charged with, or convicted of, the 1982 poisonings. That is the official status of the case as of 2026, confirmed by public records. Unsolved. The phrase, unsolved, can sound almost clinical when applied to a case like this. It sounds like a bureaucratic designation, a checkbox on a form. But behind that word are 7 people who went about ordinary days and did not come home. Behind it are families who have lived for more than 40 years without the resolution that a verdict, however imperfect, can provide. Behind it are investigators who worked the case with genuine dedication and genuine skill and could not get to the finish line. The word, unsolved, contains all of that. James W. Lewis, the man convicted of extortion in connection with the letter sent to Johnson & Johnson, lived for decades after his release from prison. He gave interviews over the years in which he maintained his claim that the letter had been an extortion attempt and not a genuine admission of involvement in the killings. Investigators were never able, by the public record, to establish his involvement in the poisonings themselves. He was never charged with the murders. Lewis died in 2023. The extortion conviction stands as the only criminal conviction ever obtained in direct connection with the Tylenol murders case. Periodic journalistic investigations over the years have examined the evidence, the timeline, the suspect pool, and the investigative decisions made in the original inquiry. Some have raised questions about leads that were not fully pursued. Others have examined the possibility that modern forensic techniques applied to preserved evidence could produce new leads. None of these examinations, at least none that have entered the public record, have produced a breakthrough. The case endures in its unresolved state. What the case has unambiguously produced is a lasting transformation of consumer safety infrastructure in the United States and, by extension, in consumer markets around the world. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act, the FDA tamper-evident packaging requirements, the industry-wide transition away from powder-filled capsules for over-the-counter medications, the protocols developed by law enforcement agencies for investigating product tampering as a specific category of crime. All of it traces directly to what happened in Chicago in the autumn of 1982. There is something both satisfying and deeply uncomfortable about that legacy. Satisfying because it represents a genuine and meaningful societal response to a genuine and terrible threat. Uncomfortable because the precautions we all benefit from were made necessary by crimes that were never solved. The perpetrator, if still living, has never answered for what happened. The victims never received justice in the form that word usually means in the context of criminal law. And yet, in a different sense, the response to this crime was itself a form of justice, not for the dead, who cannot be made whole, but for the living, who have been protected from similar acts by the systems put in place in response. How you weigh those two forms of justice is, perhaps, a personal question. But it is worth weighing. The Chicago Tylenol murders remain one of the most consequential unsolved crimes in American history. Not because of the number of victims, though 7 lives lost is a tragedy of real magnitude. Not because of the drama of the investigation, though it was extensive and urgent. But because of what the case revealed about vulnerability, about trust, about the relationship between consumers and the products they depend on, and about what happens when that relationship is deliberately violated. Someone violated it in Chicago in 1982. We still do not know who. And that fact, by itself, is worth sitting with. The safety seals on every medicine bottle in your home right now are a monument to the 7 people who died because no such seal existed when it mattered. Every time you check the packaging on a product before you take it, you are doing something that millions of Americans had no reason to do before the autumn of 1982. That habit, that instinct, that moment of checking before consuming, is the enduring and practical legacy of this case. It costs nothing, and it is worth everything. Closing thoughts and disclaimer. The Chicago Tylenol murders are, at their core, a story about trust. The trust we place in the products we use every day. The trust we extend to the systems designed to keep those products safe. The trust that communities place in law enforcement to find answers when something unthinkable happens. And the trust that victims' families place in a justice system to eventually close the wound that an unsolved crime leaves open. In the case of the Chicago Tylenol murders, some of those trusts held. The trust in corporate responsibility produced a recall that may have saved hundreds of additional lives. The trust in governmental institutions produced legislation and regulation that fundamentally improved consumer safety. The trust in investigative persistence produced a case file that has never been officially closed, a file that sits somewhere in a government office, waiting for the lead that has not yet come. But one trust was broken and never repaired. The trust that justice would reach whoever was responsible for the deaths of 7 people in the Chicago area in the autumn of 1982. That trust remains broken, the case remains open, and the person or persons responsible have never been called to account in any court of law. If you have thoughts about this case, theories grounded in the public record, questions about the evidence or the investigation, or reflections on what this case means for how we think about consumer safety and criminal justice, the comments are the place for that conversation. This community engages seriously with difficult material, and that matters. We go through every comment, and the discussion that happens in this space around cases like this one is part of why this work is worth doing. If you think you know what happened in Chicago in 1982, or even if you just have a well-reasoned instinct about where the investigation went right or went wrong, drop your theory below. And if you found this case as significant as I do, please like this video and subscribe to True Crime Mysteries so you do not miss the next one. Turn on notifications if you want to be the first to know when a new case goes up. New cases, deeply researched, all the time. Before we go, a few words of acknowledgement. The research for this episode drew on publicly available records, including news archives from the period, public court documents related to the extortion conviction of James W. Lewis, public records of the Federal Anti-Tampering Act and the FDA's packaging requirements, and published historical reporting on the investigation and its aftermath. Every claim made in this video is grounded in that public record. Where the public record is ambiguous or incomplete, we have said so. Where it is definitive, we have presented it as such. That commitment to accuracy is not a legal formality. It is a moral one, particularly when the people discussed include victims who deserved better than what happened to them, and individuals who have not been convicted of the crime at the center of this case. Our thoughts remain with the victims of the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders and with their families, who have lived for more than 4 decades with a loss that was never explained and a wrong that was never legally righted. Their lives mattered, their stories matter, and the changes their deaths made possible, as inadequate as those changes are as a substitute for justice, are a part of every American's daily life. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.